They had him on his knees on the pavement of Oleander Street at 7:54 on a Friday evening, hands behind his head, the gun out, and one of the officers was saying something that was not part of any protocol, something low between the two of them, the kind of thing that is said in the space between the law and the person applying it. The man on his knees was wearing his service dress uniform, the Army service uniform in army green, the brass buttons, the chest full of ribbons in their precise order, the rank insignia on the shoulder that said what he was to anyone trained to read it. He was not moving, he was not speaking. He had his hands behind his head, and he was breathing at the rate of a man who has learned to control his breathing in conditions far worse than a residential street in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he was looking at the asphalt 3 feet in front of his knees, with the specific focus of someone choosing deliberately what to look at. The second officer was on his radio. The first was still talking, not to dispatch, not into the air, at the man on his knees. The man on his knees did not respond. He had put his phone on the ground beside him when they told him to, and the phone was face up, and the screen had been recording since before they told him to put it down. 11 minutes later, 2 military police vehicles turned onto Oleander Street from the Bragg Boulevard end and sealed both sides of the block. 4 soldiers in uniform stepped out of the first vehicle. A man in the rank of major stepped out of the second. He was not running. Nobody was running. That was the part that the neighbors watching from their porches would talk about afterward, that nobody ran. His name was Sergeant First Class Quadwo Emmanuel Mensah, and he was 37 years old, and he had been in the United States Army for 16 years, 2 months and 11 days, and in those 16 years, he had served 3 overseas deployments, 14 months in Iraq in 2009 and 2010, 11 months in Afghanistan in 2013, and 8 months in Kuwait in 2018, and he had been awarded the Bronze Star for actions during his second deployment, the citation for which was in a frame on the wall of his mother's apartment in the Eastway Optimist neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, because she had asked for it, and he did not see a reason to say no. He was 5'11" and 196 pounds, with a build that his former drill sergeant had once described, in the specific vocabulary of the Army, as optimal, and hands that were large enough that when he set them behind his head on Oleander Street, the fingers overlapped at the crown in a way that would have looked almost restful if not for the context. He had been out of his vehicle for 30 seconds when the first officer approached him. His vehicle was a 2019 Ford F-150 in dark blue, parked legally at the curb outside the home of his aunt, Mrs. Abana Mensah Owusu, where he had been expected for dinner at 7:45. He smelled of the sandalwood soap he had used since 2008, which was the year his mother had sent him the first bar in a care package to Forward Operating Base Falcon outside Baghdad, wrapped in a brown paper bag with a note that said, "So you remember what home smells like." He had used it every morning since, without exception, at every base and post and temporary station, because his mother had been right about the smell, and he was not in the habit of arguing with things she had been right about. Under the uniform jacket, his heart rate was 68 beats per minute. He had checked it on his watch when they told him to get down, not because he needed to know it, but because focusing on a specific measurement was a technique his unit's combat stress officer had taught him in 2013, and that he had found reliable ever since. He had grown up the eldest of 3 children of Isaac and Comfort Mensah, who had emigrated from Kumasi, Ghana, in 1984, and settled in the Eastway Optimist neighborhood of Charlotte, where Isaac worked as a machinist at a metal fabrication plant on Wilkinson Boulevard for 21 years, and Comfort worked as a nurse's aide at the Carolinas Medical Center on Blythe Boulevard for 18 years, and then as a licensed practical nurse for 6 more, after she passed her boards at the age of 49, which her colleagues celebrated in the break room on a Thursday afternoon with a cake that said "Finally" on it in blue frosting, which Comfort had thought was the funniest thing she had ever seen. Quadwo had watched both of them get up and go to work, without complaint for as long as he could remember. He had watched them do it in the years when money was tight enough that the heat went off in February, and in the years after it was not, and he had never seen either of them choose anything other than the longer road when the longer road was the right one. He had enlisted at 21 with 2 years of community college behind him, and a letter of recommendation from his high school ROTC commander, a man named Captain Al-Danjuma, who had written in the letter that Quadro Mensa was the kind of soldier the Army needed more of, and had been right about that too. The ribbons on his chest, read in the order a trained eye reads them, told 16 years in a language made of color and metal. The Bronze Star was fourth from the left on the top row. The Army Commendation Medal was beside it. Below them were the Iraq Campaign Medal with 2 campaign stars, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal, among others. He had not worn the uniform to dinner for the purpose of wearing his ribbons. He had come directly from a ceremony at Fort Bragg at which he had been formally assigned to a new role in the training division, and had not had time to go home and change. He had called his Aunt Abena from the base to say he would be a little late, and to tell her he was coming in uniform, and she had said she hoped he was hungry, because she had made jollof rice and chicken, and there was enough for 6 people, which there was always enough for at her table, regardless of how many people were expected. He had parked the dark blue F-150 at the curb at 7:51 p.m. He had been outside the vehicle for 30 seconds when Officer M. Gentry of the Fayetteville Police Department pulled up behind him and got out of the patrol car. 30 seconds after that, Officer Gentry's partner, Officer D. Calvert, was beside him. The stated reason for the stop, as Officer Gentry would later document, was that the vehicle had been reported earlier in the day in connection with a separate incident. The report number cited in his documentation referred to a call made at 2:17 p.m. that afternoon about a dark-colored truck in the vicinity of a commercial dispute on Murchison Road. The F-150 was dark blue. It had been parked on Fort Bragg since 6 a.m. that morning. The drive from Fort Bragg to Oleander Street took 22 minutes. The math was in the phone's location data, which had been running the whole time. Oleander Street on a Friday evening in November had the particular quality of a residential block preparing for the weekend. 2 men working on a car in a driveway 4 houses down. A woman watering a potted plant on her porch across the street. A teenager on a bicycle at the far end of the block who stopped pedaling when he saw the patrol car pull up. The air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere close, and the particular exhaust warmth of a street that had held the week's traffic all day, and was only now releasing it. Quadro had placed his phone on the ground when they told him to. What they did not know, because the screen was face-up but dim, was that he had opened the camera app at the moment he saw the patrol car pull up behind him, not from fear, not as a defensive gesture, but from the same training impulse that had made him check his heart rate. Documentation is preparation. He had learned that in year 4 of his service, and had not unlearned it since. The camera had been running for 90 seconds before the gun came out. Officer Calvert was on his radio requesting a second unit. Officer Gentry had the weapon drawn and held at low ready, and was the one doing the talking. He asked for the vehicle registration and the insurance. Quadro said from his knees that both were in the glove box. Gentry told him not to move toward the vehicle. Quadro said he understood. He had not moved toward the vehicle. He did not move toward the vehicle. A man named Gerald, who lived 3 doors from Abena, and had been on his stoop with a glass of sweet tea when the patrol car pulled up, watched from 30 feet away. He was the age of Quadro's father. He did not go inside. He did not call anyone. He stood on his stoop, and he was a witness, and in the absence of other options, a witness is sometimes the most available thing a person can be. The second unit arrived at 8:01 p.m. 4 officers on Oleander Street now, and 1 man in an Army service uniform on his knees on the pavement, and the block had the compressed, overpopulated quality of a space where authority has overcorrected. One of the new officers, his nameplate read Torres, looked at the uniform. He looked at the ribbons. He said something to Gentry in a low voice. Gentry said something back. Torres looked at the uniform again and said, slightly louder, "He's got the uniform on, man." Gentry said, "I'm aware." Torres said nothing more. He stepped back toward the second patrol car and leaned against the hood and looked at the pavement, and that was the end of whatever Torres had been about to say. He had been close to the right thing. He had not gotten there. What Officer Gentry said to Quadro Mensa while he was on his knees was documented by 2 sources: the phone screen recording, which captured audio clearly enough to transcribe, and the body camera footage that the Fayetteville Police Department would later release under a public records request. What he said is in the record. It is the kind of thing that does not need to be repeated here to be understood. It was said by a man with a gun to a man on his knees in a service uniform on a public street in front of his aunt's house, and the neighbors on their porches heard it, and the phone recorded it, and the body camera recorded it, and Kwadwo Mensah heard every word of it and said nothing and kept his hands where they were, and kept his heart rate where it was, and kept his eyes on the asphalt 3 feet in front of his knees, and waited. There was a moment at around 8:03 when it appeared the situation might resolve on its own. Officer Torres had retrieved the vehicle registration from the glove box and read it and handed it back and said something to Gentry that the audio made difficult to hear, but that ended with, "The address checks out." There was a 3-second pause. Kwadwo's hands were still behind his head. Gentry was standing over him. For those 3 seconds, the block held its breath. Then Gentry said something else. It was not directed at Torres. It was directed at the man on his knees. It was quieter than what had come before, which made it harder for the phone to pick up cleanly, but the body camera was close enough. That second thing is also in the record. Gerald on his stoop heard it and put his glass down on the railing. Abena at her window had heard it a second before, and had already turned from the window and was walking to her nightstand. If what's building in this story is already in your chest, stay with me, because what turns the block is not what you think. The person who called the major was not Kwadwo, it was his aunt. Mrs. Abena Mensah Owusu was 63 years old and had been standing at her front window on Oleander Street since 7:53 p.m., watching because she had heard the patrol car door and gone to the window and seen what was happening to her nephew on the pavement in front of her house. She was 4'11", with close-cropped gray hair and hands that had been strong since before she left Kumasi at 26, and she was wearing the house clothes she had been cooking in all afternoon, a blue-print house dress and old slippers, and she stood at that window in her slippers and watched them put Kwadwo on his knees, and watched the gun come out, and watched Torres hand back the registration, and watched the 3-second pause, and then watched Gentry say the second thing, and she turned from the window and walked to the bedroom, and opened the drawer of her nightstand. The card was under a prayer book and a pack of throat lozenges, and a photograph of her late husband Emmanuel, in his Ghanaian funeral cloth, taken in 1999. She had kept the card in that drawer for 2 years since the neighborhood meeting, and she had told herself she kept it because it seemed sensible to keep it, not because she believed she would ever need it, and she had been wrong about that, which she noted without resentment as she picked up the card and walked back to the kitchen where her phone was charging on the counter. She dialed the number at 7:56 p.m. The duty officer was Captain Obina Achebe, who had been in the Army for 6 years and was on post that night, and who, when he heard what Abena said, asked her 3 questions in sequence: the full name and rank of the soldier, the street address, and whether the soldier was injured. She answered all 3 in under 20 seconds. He verified the duty status in the system in 40 more, confirmed the gate log, and dispatched at 7:57. Then he made the second call to Major Leonard Kweku Owusu Boateng, who was the senior officer on post, who picked up on the second ring, who said, "I'm already moving," before Captain Achebe finished the sentence, which was the kind of response that comes from a person who has been this kind of officer for long enough that the calculations happen before the words arrive. 2 military police vehicles turned onto Oleander Street from the Bragg Boulevard end at 8:05 p.m. They did not come with sirens. They came quietly, which was its own kind of signal. 4 soldiers stepped out of the first vehicle and took positions without being directed to, the specific, unhurried choreography of people who have trained for presence without aggravation, who know that the purpose of filling a space is not to create alarm, but to establish that the space is now filled. The second vehicle parked behind the first. Major Owusu Boateng stepped out. He was wearing his service uniform, and he was 44 years old, and he moved the way he moved. He stepped out of the second vehicle at 8:05. He walked toward Officer Gentry and Officer Calvert with his rank visible and his bearing providing context for the rank. He said his name and rank. He said Sergeant First Class Mensah's name and rank. He said in a voice that was moderate in volume and absolute in register, "This soldier is active duty United States Army, assigned to Fort Bragg. He has been in continuous service for 16 years. I will need you to confirm the basis for this detention, and I will need his property returned to him." He did not say anything else. He stood. He waited. Officer Gentry's gun had already gone back into its holster before the major reached the two vehicles. The sight of two military police units sealing the block had accomplished that. Now Officer Gentry was holding a piece of paper, which was the incident report he had been filling out on the hood of his patrol car. And he was looking at the major and the 4 soldiers who had taken positions behind him without being told to. And he said, "We had a report," and the major said, "The vehicle was on Fort Bragg from 0600 this morning. I have the gate log." He had it on his phone. He showed it. Officer Gentry looked at the gate log. He looked at Quadwo Mensah, who had risen from his knees when the major arrived and was standing beside his truck with his uniform jacket straightened and his hands at his sides. He looked at the 4 soldiers. He looked at Major Owusu Boateng. He looked at the gate log again. Then he said, "You're free to go," and walked back to his patrol car. Quadwo picked up his phone from the pavement. The screen was still recording. He stopped the recording. He looked at his aunt's house, where Abena was standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest and her slippers still on her feet, and her face doing nothing dramatic, just watching him, the way a woman watches someone she raised alongside her own children, and has worried about every deployment, and is not going to perform relief in front of now that she is feeling it. He walked to the front door. She stepped aside to let him in. She did not say anything immediately. She went to the kitchen and brought the jollof rice and the chicken, which was still warm because she had left the pot on low. The way you leave a pot on low when you don't know exactly when someone is arriving, but you intend for them to eat well when they do. She set a plate in front of him at the kitchen table and sat down across from him and poured herself a glass of water, and they ate for a while without talking. The rice had the particular depth of a jollof made by someone who has been making it for 40 years, and measures nothing because nothing needs measuring anymore. The tomato paste and the Scotch bonnet and the bay leaf all in the right proportion by memory, which is the only measuring cup that tells the truth. He told her it was the best he had eaten in 3 years, which was how long it had been since his last visit, and she said she knew, and she told him to eat more. The phone recording was 17 minutes and 43 seconds long. His cousin in Charlotte saw it first and sent it to 3 people, and by the following morning it had been viewed 1.4 million times. By the following afternoon, the Fayetteville Police Department had issued a statement acknowledging that the incident was under review. By the end of the week, both officers Gentry and Calvert had been placed on administrative reassignment pending a formal review by the department's Office of Professional Standards. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division made contact with the Fayetteville PD on Tuesday of the following week. The review was opened. The gate log was part of the record. The phone recording was part of the record. The body camera footage was part of the record. 6 weeks after Oleander Street, the Fayetteville Police Department announced a new protocol requiring verification of any service member's military status and duty station through the Fort Bragg Liaison Office before any detention on or near post was escalated to a weapons-drawn engagement. The protocol was developed in consultation with the Fort Bragg Military Police Command, which had requested the meeting. Major Owusu Boateng attended as the Army's representative. He sat at the table and said what was required and did not say what was not required. And when the protocol was signed, he drove back to post and filed his report, and went to his next meeting. Quadwo Mensah was back at Fort Bragg the Monday after Oleander Street. He was in the training division, which was the new role he had been formally assigned at the ceremony. On the Friday it happened. The ceremony he had been coming from when he parked on the curb outside his aunt's house. He reported for duty at 0600. He did his job. He did not speak publicly about what had occurred on Oleander Street. Not then. Not for several months. Not until an interview with a reporter from the Charlotte Observer, in which he said, among other things, "I wore the uniform because I had come from a ceremony. I did not think it would matter. It should not have mattered. The uniform does not change what you are owed. What you are owed does not change." The reporter quoted him on that. It ran in the print edition on a Wednesday. Comfort Mensah, his mother an Eastway optimist, read it at the kitchen table on Wilkinson Boulevard over her morning coffee, and cut it out and put it in the drawer with the Bronze Star citation that she had kept for 9 years. Because some things you do not leave lying around. There are people who only see a threat when they see certain things. A dark vehicle, a certain neighborhood, a certain body. They have learned to read a surface and act on the reading before they have read the person. That habit, the habit of the surface, is the oldest and most expensive mistake in any institution that carries authority. It costs the institution its credibility. It costs the person on their knees something that does not have a number. What it could not cost Quadwo Mensa was 16 years. It could not cost him the gate log. It could not cost him the phone recording that was already running before they told him to put the phone down. Because he had learned, in 16 years of service in situations where the difference between a good outcome and a bad one was whether someone documented it, the documentation is not paranoia. Documentation is preparation. It is the same discipline that puts your hands at the right height and keeps your heart rate at 68 and looks at the asphalt 3 feet in front of your knees and waits, because the waiting, done correctly, is its own kind of authority. What the two officers on Oleander Street did not see was an aunt 4'11" standing at a window, who had kept a card in her nightstand for 2 years. They did not see the card. They did not see the nightstand. They saw a dark truck and a man on the pavement and thought the situation was theirs. The situation was never theirs. If you or someone you love has been put on their knees by a system that refused to read past the surface, leave your answer in the comments. Well, what happened and who showed up? Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people this world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.